The BBC's internal watchdog, the BBC Trust, has upheld the complaint against one of the corporation's flagship news programmes, Radio 4's Today, for providing biased and misleading information in its reporting of Israel. The complaint refers to a report by Middle East correspondent Kevin Connolly in 2011 on the anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War, which examined the legacy of the conflict between Israel and several neighbouring states. According to the Trust's own findings, a listener alleged that the report wrongly gave the impression that Israel occupied land 3 times its original size as a result of the war, when it had given 90% of the land captured in 1967 back to Egypt. The programme also, the complainant alleged, gave a misleading impression that Israel was not willing to trade land for peace, when it had reached peace deals with Jordan and Egypt that included transfers of conquered territories. The Trust found the report had been inaccurate on both points, and the complaint should be upheld. Dr. Jonathan Boyd from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research has carried out studies into Jewish people's attitudes to the BBC.
It seems to me the latest report would back up the research findings that we have, which showed that about 80% of British Jews felt that the BBC is biased against Israel. And one of the interesting things about that finding is, even though there were distinctions between British Jewish opinions, whether they were sort of more left-wing or more right-wing in terms of their attitudes to Israel, there was still there was an overwhelming sense that British Jews felt this to be the case about the BBC.
The BBC Trust partially upheld several complaints about the accuracy and impartiality of reports by the BBC's Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen 5 years ago. He recently criticised previous investigations by the Trust into the corporation's reporting of the Middle East as flawed. He told the British independent newspaper that the response to complaints about his coverage had been influenced by pro-Israel lobbyists. Despite this, BBC News remains one of the most popular news sources for British Jews.
One of the other findings is that 88% of British Jews watch the BBC News. It's still by far and away the most popular source. And it's still a very credible source in all sorts of ways. So I don't think it's going to affect their ratings particularly.
The latest findings put the BBC Trust on course for another row with the BBC's news division. The conclusions would appear to show the corporation has failed to learn from the 2004 Balin report, which the BBC commissioned to look into its coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The BBC then refused to release the document on the grounds that it was produced as an internal editorial exercise, but it was rumoured to have found that its coverage was anti-Israel. However, Dr. Boyd acknowledges reporting on Israel is problematic for all news organisations.
I think reporting about Israel is difficult. It's complex. We're dealing with a very, very complicated situation, and I have a degree of sympathy for journalists who are trying to cover very complex politics, often in a minute or a minute and a half or even less. So trying to cover it, I think, is difficult, but nonetheless, that's their job. The job of any journalist is to try and cover what's going on in as accurate a way as possible, and perhaps even more so the BBC, who have who are funded by the taxpayer, and therefore perhaps have more a responsibility than private media companies.
Both BBC News and the journalist involved in the latest report accused of bias have so far refused to comment. However, the publication of the BBC Trust's findings is likely to spark more outrage among the corporation's journalists. This is Edward Barron for JN1 at BBC headquarters in central London.